All right, to continue where we left off talking about Krebs cycle, we're going to use things in the Krebs cycle like NADH and FADH2. Those electron carriers are going to be used in the electron transport chain. And so let's just quickly kind of define electron transport chain, and we've kind of already talked about it in photosynthesis, but here it is again. Electron transport chain is located on the inner membrane. Remember those folds called cristae. And electron transport chain, ETC, we're going to abbreviate, is the site of ATP synthesis. Not that ATP is not created anywhere else, but the most of it, per glucose molecule, 32 ATP are being created on the ETC. That's quite a bit. That's over 80% of the ATP being made in the process of cellular respiration, all being made on the inner membrane. All right, moving on to chemiosmosis, and we've already seen this definition before in photosynthesis. It's the same definition, but it's important, so here it is again. Diffusion of hydrogen ions or protons through ATP synthase to create ATP. And then number 8. Oops. The role of oxygen in cellular respiration, and here's why, probably the number one reason that oxygen is so important for our bodies, is simply it is called the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. The final electron acceptor, and when you see the process, that'll make a little bit more sense. All right, I'm going to the Mcgraw-Hill electron transport and ATP synthesis animation. I would strongly suggest that you watch this on your own, but at least going through it this one time in the notes should give you a pretty good idea of what's happening. Again, keep in mind we're inside of the mitochondria, so there's a chopped open version. We're going to zoom into that little box there. That's the inner membrane. Remember these folds called cristae? Lots of surface area. The more these things are folded up means more chemical reactions, more ATP being created, which is a benefit for whichever organism this mitochondrion is located in. So we're going to zoom in. Let me play this at kind of a normal speed. Zoom into the mitochondria. We're looking at just the inner membrane. So we have inner membrane space out here. That is the space between inner and outer membrane. We have the mitochondrial matrix. Again, that's where the Krebs cycle is taking place. Keep in mind, Krebs cycle is making electron carriers, NADH and FADH2. Notice where they are located, how they come into the inner membrane, and then how they're going to be released to come back with more electrons once they picked up some more electrons. So here comes NADH, add a hydrogen, not that important that you remember that. And FADH2, again, remember those are electron carriers. So here's the kind of first donation of electrons, little red guys here. And notice what happens is hydrogens come off and they're going to build up in this inner membrane space. There's going to be a higher concentration on the outside here, up here, so that they can diffuse back through ATP synthase. We don't care about the names of any of these enzymes. All we care about is what's happening. Electrons get passed from protein to protein. It causes protons to be pumped into the intermembrane space. FADH2 is going to donate some more electrons, more hydrogens being pumped. As the electrons pass from protein to protein, that we don't care the names of these guys. Again, just keep in mind what is happening. The energy from those electrons is drawing hydrogens into the intermembrane space from the matrix. And right there was a very important part that went kind of quickly. But oxygen, O2 here, is actually kind of hanging out by this enzyme, this protein right here. And it's actually causing these electrons to eventually come through the ETC and get stuck onto oxygen, adding some hydrogens to create water. And that's what that was right there. So a couple oxygens come in, they're going to pick up the electrons and attach themselves to oxygen and hydrogens to create water. So again, you're breathing out, exhaling, think of it this way, you're exhaling CO2 from the Krebs cycle and water from inner membrane when you breathe out on the school bus and make silly little pictures on the window. Or at least when you did. Hopefully you're not still doing that. And so this again just goes through how those electrons are transported kind of all at once. Hydrogens are pumped, protons are pumped. And here's all of that taking place at the same time. You can see those hydrogens are going to diffuse back out through ATP synthase, which is going to cause this enzyme to combine an ADP and a phosphate together to make ATP. And there's a lot of it being made here. There's a lot of these folds on the inner membrane, a lot of locations for these proteins to be doing their job, especially this guy, ATP synthase, making lots of ATP. So make sure that you take the time to watch this animation through a couple times. It's going to help make a lot more sense out of the ETC. There's a lot of details in here that we're talking about. There are a lot that we're skipping over, the names of these enzymes. But just in general, kind of get the idea of what's happening here. And keep in mind how this relates to photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, we were using water to get electrons at the beginning of electron transport chain. Here's just the opposite. We're making water by combining oxygen with hydrogen using those electrons that came through the electron transport chain. So a lot of backwards things are happening here. A lot of the similar things from ETC from photosynthesis and electron carriers. But in photosynthesis, light reactions, we had electron carriers being made. Here we have electron carriers being used. Again, the water, we had water being used in the dark reactions. Here, water is being made. So a lot of backwards things that are happening here, but if you learned it one way, it should be a little bit easier to learn it the opposite way, which is kind of what's happening here. Although a lot of these details are the same. As the electrons move from protein to protein, they're pumping protons, hydrogens, which are going to diffuse back through into the matrix through ATP synthase, which kind of powers that enzyme to create a lot of ATP. So here's what I'd like you to do on your notes, is kind of just take this picture and recreate what you saw in the animation to the best of your ability, and just keep in mind kind of the important parts that we just went over. Like oxygen, just kind of hanging out there, waiting for those electrons to come by, which you're going to do that too. Electrons going through the system, attaching themselves onto water. You can show how the path of the electrons goes from protein to protein to protein, eventually gets stuck onto oxygen there with some hydrogens to make water. You can also show how the hydrogens are being pumped into the inner membrane space. I'm just color coding to hopefully make it a little bit easier. Hydrogens are being pumped into the inner membrane space. Sorry, too high. We also want to show how FADH2 and NADH are our electron carriers, donating them to the inner membrane, to the ETC. And once they are used, they're recycled parts, just like how we saw in photosynthesis. Their recycled parts are going to get spit out. To go get more electrons to come back later. And again, the most important part of this is how ADP comes in to help create ATP. And again, just somehow show how that works in a picture, although sometimes it's difficult to show things happening in a picture. That gives you a pretty good snapshot right there of what's happening on the electron transport chain on the inner membrane for the production of 32 ATP. Keep in mind our electron carriers, the job of the electrons is to pump protons. The job of oxygen is the final electron acceptor. That's where those electrons are going to wind up to create water. ATP synthase is our enzyme that's going to create ATP, just like in photosynthesis. Oops, only I could spell. And the process ATP synthase is using to create ATP, this diffusion of hydrogens, is called chemiosmosis. One word that I'm smashing into the side there. So one word, chemiosmosis. The process of diffusion of hydrogens through ATP synthase to make ATP from ADP and, just to have it, antiphosphate. So that's it. That's your snapshot of the electron transport chain.